Good evening, everyone. My name is Donna Wiss. I am the Regional Public Engagement Specialist for Egypt and North Africa. And what that essentially means is that I oversee the American spaces in this part of the world. And if you're not familiar with American spaces, please stay on till the end of our program, and we're going to provide you some more information and a QR code where you can sign up for future American spaces information. So on behalf of the U.S. Embassy here in Cairo, I'd like to thank you for joining us and welcome you to today's Road to COP27 program, as we look forward to Egypt hosting COP27 in Sharm in the coming months. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today. She is Dr. Anjuli Bamzai, and she is our resident senior science advisor on global climate change at the National Science Foundation. We have the pleasure of welcoming her here to Egypt for 2 months, where she's working with the Egyptian Ministry of Agriculture's Research Center. Some of you may be familiar with CCIC, which is the Climate Change Information Center. And in the run-up to COP27, Dr. Bamzai has a particular focus on drought early warning systems. So I want to thank her for leading the efforts here in Egypt to introduce our U.S. experts to the Egyptian public through this series of talks. I'd also like to thank our other guests today, Dr. Becker-Reshef, Director of NASA Harvest. And this is NASA's program on food security and agriculture, which is made up of a diverse consortium of more than 50 partners from the public and private sectors. They are focused on advancing the use of satellite observations across the agricultural sector. She is a research professor at the Department of Geographical Sciences at the University of Maryland in the United States. And she's also an adjunct professor at the University of Strasbourg. Her work is focused on the application of satellite observations for agricultural monitoring from the field to global scales, supporting decisions in food security, sustainability, and agricultural markets. So during this program, we would like to hear from you. So we ask you to please drop your questions, your chats into the chat box. We have someone monitoring that, and Dr. Becker-Reshef will be handling those questions from you. And now it's my distinct pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to Dr. Bamzai.
Thank you, Donna. Good evening, everyone. As Donna mentioned, I am Anjuli Bamzai. I'm doing a 2-month stint as Embassy Science Fellow here in Egypt. It's actually my second visit. We lived here a long time back, so I'm really enjoying the hospitality of the State Department, the Agricultural Research Center, and the Egyptian people. Really enjoying my stay, and I'm leaving next week. So this evening, I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Inbal Becker-Reshef. As Donna mentioned, she is program coordinator of NASA's Harvest program. And the Harvest program pays specific attention to the use of remote sensing data for agricultural monitoring. Dr. Reshef has also been working on food security issues, both on the national and the international scene. She has received various prizes for her work, and she's a research professor at the University of Maryland at College Park, and also has an adjunct appointment at the University of Strasbourg in France. Without further ado, I'm going to turn over the virtual screen to Inbal, Dr. Becker-Reshef.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So it's a great pleasure to join you here today and to provide a satellite Earth observations perspective on providing agricultural monitoring through the use of satellite data in support of agricultural market sustainability and food security decisions. And so to provide some context for our work, as it has become increasingly evident as we get further and further away from the Sustainable Development Goal 2, the target of zero hunger, food security still remains one of the most pressing issues that we face in this century. And the invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing pandemic have only served to highlight how fragile and interconnected our food system is. And therefore, innovation in how we develop and monitor our agriculture across the world and developing ways that are scalable, that can provide information that's timely, and that are transparent are absolutely critical and a key component in helping to address this global challenge. And so I think everybody recognizes that agriculture and climate change are in a negative feedback loop. Agriculture significantly contributes to global warming, and at the same time, food production systems are very adversely impacted by a warming and more erratic climate and extreme weather. We have a very fast growing population that will require more food to be produced on increasingly degraded land. And in fact, according to some FAO estimates, the current rate of degradation, if we continue with the current rate of degradation, we'll be out of topsoil in another 55 years. And so there's some recent studies that some of you might have seen that have some alarming results, and they show that in many regions of the world, the impacts on crop yields are projected to start to be seen much sooner than in previous models. And some of these show that with impacts in the next 10 years or so, and particularly for corn, for example, some models estimate that there will be losses of already 20% in yields due to climate change. And so if we just take this year, for example, we've seen a severe drought impacting crops in the US, and that's still continuing. Also earlier on in the season, impacting the wheat belt. A heat wave that's damaged crops in India, and an unprecedented heat waves and droughts that have reduced production across major growing regions in Europe. Dry conditions that impacted corn and soybeans in Brazil and in Argentina. Crop failure due to droughts across parts of Northern Africa and the Middle East. And a fourth consecutive drought in the Horn of Africa that's leading to catastrophic food insecurity. And most recently, in the last few weeks, we've all heard of the catastrophic flooding also in Pakistan that's wiping away large proportions of their croplands. So climate change, COVID, and most recently also the war in Ukraine really can highlight to us how interconnected our food systems are and how sensitive they are to external shocks. And these have really serious repercussions for global food trade, for food access, and for food security for millions of people around the world. And satellite data can help us to provide information across the world on our agricultural systems and help to provide some transparency and information, in particular in areas that we can't get to on the ground, like in conflict region as well. And so many people think of NASA and they might think of the Artemis mission to the moon, or they might think of deep space exploration. And a lot of times they don't think about agriculture. But actually, some of the earliest Earth-observing satellites were designed with agriculture monitoring as a key application area. And so in essence, what we have are satellites that are going over us all the time, rotating around the Earth as the Earth turns. And what that's doing is they're collecting a lot of information about the Earth's surface, about the air above it, and in wavelengths, both in the wavelengths that our eyes can see, but also in wavelengths beyond what we can see. And these provide us data across the globe, but down at the field scale, that are objective, that are repeatable, that are scalable. And very importantly, satellites also have a long, dense time record. And what that means is that it enables us to look at change through time, and to look at how things have changed, whether it's from one day to the next, as agriculture develops very quickly, but also from one decade to the next, and 1 year to the next, and one season to the next. And they can provide us information this is an example of information coming from NASA VIR satellite. We get a global look every single day across the world. And we also have a lot of higher resolution satellites, and also on the commercial side. And this is an example of information that we get at 3-meter resolution, all the way down actually at the field scale on a daily basis. And so here's an example from that satellite from that satellite company called Planet. And these are some of the images that they just captured over the devastating floods in Pakistan. And so it's important for us, as things can happen very quickly and rapidly, to have information that's really timely, that's global, and that we can have from one day to the next. And here again is zooming out a little bit, again at Pakistan, this time looking at data both from the Landsat 8 and Landsat 9 satellites, showing on the left side the before on August 4th, and the after on August 28th. And you can see that expansive water of the Indus expanding and the flooding extent, and a zoomed out version of where we're looking at from NASA VIRS data. And there's some estimates that the government has put out that more than 700,000 livestock and 2 million acres of croplands and orchards have been lost due to the flooding. So satellite data, what do? They offer us information that's cost effective, that's timely, that's transparent on things like crop types, right? Which crops are growing where and when are they growing and how are they developing? Indication of crop health, indication of stress due to heat stress, due to drought. And then we can use these kinds of data in models to also start to forecast and predict final crop yields. And we can do that at a field scale, and we can do that all the way through up to the global scale. And this provides really important information that can help form the basis for different policy recommendations, for rapid responses to developing concerns and to shortfalls and to other food security concerns. And so in this context, NASA launched its Food Security and Agriculture Program, as was introduced. We're called NASA Harvest, and we were launched in 2017, and it sits within the Applied Sciences program at NASA. And under Harvest, our mission is to enable and to advance the adoption of satellite data in order to benefit food security, agriculture, and sustainability across the globe, and really trying to help bridge the gap between scientific findings and practical applications. And over the past few years, as we've launched, we've seen a tremendous increase in the interest in our activities from across really the agricultural sector, whether that's coming from governments, from ministries of agriculture, from humanitarian organizations, but also from industry and ag tech startups, because these data are continuing to generate new opportunities that provide accurate, reliable, and timely information for a whole broad of applications that can provide information that are crop specific, really down from the field scale all the way up at the global scale. And so our approach at Harvest is very important, is to work with stakeholders. So almost every activity that we start, we have a stakeholder that we're working very closely with, that we're co-developing, that we're making sure we're not just developing science that we think is needed, but rather we're developing information products that are developed to meet a specific need of our stakeholder. Again, whether that might be a Ministry of Agriculture, or that might be a humanitarian organization who is trying to mobilize food aid, for example. And so we're structured across different programmatic initiatives that are listed here. We have over 35 different projects that are active with a whole host of different partners, again, from across the agricultural sector. As we've mentioned, we have over 50 different partners that we work with. We are a consortium of partners. And here you can see some of the different topics that we're focused on, whether that's early warning for early action, for insurance and climate finance, sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and rapid action for agricultural policy support. And I'll try to give you examples of some of these areas of activity. Again, why are we end user focused? We know that even if we develop the best crop type map that we think can then help a government improve their agricultural statistics, for example, if that partner wasn't involved in how this model was created, how this data is created, if they're not driving that need and have the trust in that information and in that process, they're not going to take that up and adopt it. And our goal is really not to become a provider for different stakeholders, but rather to co-develop and then transition those capabilities on to our stakeholders. And so that's really, really critical. And so we've developed a lot of different kinds of tools, different dashboards, whether that's on supply chains and looking at trade, or whether that's looking at crop conditions. And also then with our partner organizations and with private sector, where they're adopting some of our models and system into their own dashboards and information systems for their clients and farmers. So to enable nearly all of our activities, we have to have information on what crops are growing where, and what their productivity is. And so when we are able to pair ground data, so even though we have satellites, I should say, it's really important to also have ground data, and we can pair them with different machine learning models, we can then start to develop information that we can validate and develop models that we can scale so that we can ultimately look at and map, for example, where are different commodity crops growing and how are they changing through time in response to weather, in response to conflict, in response to different policies. And so this is an example from the GLAD Lab that's led by Matt Hansen, part of the Harvest Consortium. And what they did is they ran a global cropland classification and looked at change. So they looked at every year from 2003 to 2019, and then could look at changes in croplands. And what they found is that global cropland expansion has accelerated over the past 2 decades, with a near doubling of the annual expansion rate, and most notably in Africa, with half of the new cropland area, about 49%, replacing natural vegetation and tree cover. But still, one of the main challenges that we have for being able to produce this kind of information is actually having access to the ground data that's helping to train our models and helping to validate the models and the maps that we then produce. And this is especially true in smallholder agricultural systems, which are much more complicated to map. And so to address these challenges, this is a major focus of our machine learning team. And they've been working extensively on innovating methods to learn from sparse and heterogeneous labels for croplands and crop type mapping. And what they do is these provide then field level information every season depicting which crops are growing where. And this kind of information is critical, for example, for informing crop area estimates of a government or informing agricultural insurance, as well as this information then feeds into some of our yield forecasting models. And so we have also a lot of work focused on yield estimation, right? What the productivity of crops are, and being able to forecast these as early as we can, because these are important, whether it's for global markets and agricultural market transparency, or whether that's for early warning of an impending shortfall. And therefore that kind of information is very important for mobilizing humanitarian assistance. Or this kind of information can be very important to understand yield gaps and help to evaluate different targets or interventions for different programs. And so here we're looking at different examples of some of our yield models. We have around 4 or 5 different in-house yield models that we have that range from the field scale, subnational scale, all the way through up to the global scale. And while initially a lot of our work on yield was focused on the big production, big commodity countries and crops, we've now started to adapt these models to forecast crop yields in smallholder dominated countries with some very promising results. And so here's an example of that same model that we looked at and adapted for smallholder countries. We're also, this is looking at, this is an example from Vietnam, and scaling it down at the subnational scale. And similarly, we're doing that and getting all the way down to being able to forecast yields at the specific field scales. We've also, so a big area that we focus a lot on is not just these quantitative measures of crop production, but also looking at qualitative measures and indicators of crop health as the season is progressing. And so one of the things we've done is developed a tool for evaluating crop conditions at the subnational level through different agrometeorological indicators that are satellite generated. And these, we have a dashboard. You're all welcome to go and see it. This is the link for that. And so here we have the majority of the countries with the major crops that are being grown. And then you can look there at the progression of what the crop looks like. And so this is an example from Morocco from this season. We know there was a significant drought that significantly impacted production of wheat. And so the blue line on that top upper corner chart is essentially showing NDVI. This is a measure of, if you will, of crop health. And it's comparing it both to the average, which is in black, and to the previous year. And what you see is this year's crop development was well below average conditions. And so we can track that as the season is going. Similarly, the next chart over is looking at precipitation deficit. Again, everywhere that's red, that's how much below. This is cumulative precipitation during the season. And so we can start to look at the different factors that are leading to these crop health issues. We have soil moisture, we have temperature, et cetera. But ultimately, ultimately, what our goal is to help to transfer research into actionable, science-driven information in support of agricultural decisions, in support of sustainability, resilience, and food security. And so we have a large and growing focus on building an evidence basis for climate resilient agriculture. And so when we combine crop type maps with yield maps and management practices, for example, looking at tillage practices, these data can help to play a role in providing such kind of evidence. And so this is an example from work out of Stanford University on utilizing field scale yields and looking at management practices over the US and over the Corn Belt in the US to assess the impact of conservation practices on yield. And what they found is that no-till provides actually measurable yield benefits, especially in dry summers. And this kind of information is really important for policymakers, for farmers, to help and look at how best to transfer into more sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices. Another example is on using satellite data to help farmers making decisions around the amount, timing, and cost of fertilizer applications down at their field scale, and to support ultimately the uptake of conservation farming practices. And here's an example from our partners at University of Illinois, working with the Illinois Corn Growers Association on developing this tool. Now, in the context of a globalized market, it's really critical to help reduce uncertainties around crop production forecasts and estimates, in particular in major agricultural market players, as they have such an oversized impact then on global food prices and markets. And the window of time really where satellite data can help the most in these contexts is once the crop is in the ground and before it's harvested and information then from the ground is coming out from the field. And so this is actually one of the first areas, this is an area that we have been doing a lot of work on that well predates the NASA harvest work. It's work we've done for quite a long time, actually starting with the USDA, with the US Department of Agriculture. And while we were doing a lot of this kind of work on helping to use satellite data to monitor large market players and for different commodity crops, many of you will remember there was a food price crisis in 2011. And at that time, then the G20 launched two initiatives in response under their action plan on food price volatility in agriculture. One of them was called AMIS, and the other one is called GeoGlam. And these two, and we were at the time involved in setting up the GeoGlam, and actually today NASA Harvest is NASA's contribution into that G20 initiative. And the G20 ministers of agriculture felt that Earth observations could help to provide near real-time independent source of information on food commodity production prospects and provide transparency into the market. And so we were mandated to work with this agricultural market information system. And one of the first requests that they came to us was said, could you provide global transparency and consensus-driven information on global crop production for four main crops, for wheat, for corn, for soybeans, and for rice. And so we launched that in 2013, and it's what's called today the Crop Monitor. And it was really developed for the economists and for the policymakers within the AMIS, within the G20 community. And these reports have been produced since 2013. It's important to note that this brings together science-based information from over 40 different partners from around the world, many of them being ministries of agriculture. And we go through this process every month, and this is looking at our last publication of that. That's from July, the end of July. Our next release will be this coming Thursday. And basically, this is meant to provide a very quick look at, and this is for the G20 countries, but I'll show later how this has evolved, on what crop conditions look like. So anything that's green is about average, might be a little bit above or a little bit below. Where there's color is where the croplands are. So where it's a light gray, those are not croplands. And then within each country, if you'll see a dark gray, those are croplands that are not in season at the time of the specific assessment. Where you have a yellow or a red, a yellow means we have some concern, and then we'll tell you which crop we're concerned about in that particular area. And red means that we're expecting poor conditions. And then we'll give a pie chart that shows a proportion that's being impacted for each country. And so initially, while we were doing that just for the big production exporting countries, we recognized that there is a much bigger need, or an equally important need, I should say, on looking at those countries that are most at risk to food insecurity. And so together with some of the main humanitarian organizations, including the World Food Program, USAID, FAO and others, and some regional organizations as well, we launched the Crop Monitor for Early Warning. Again, this is our last assessment. You can see a lot of reds across Eastern Africa, as well as across North Africa and the Middle East. And so this is, again, reflecting some of the concerns as they go, and our next update will be on Thursday. And so we've since very recently started to bring these two together, and now we're starting to put out a global view every month, because we recognize that we can't look separately at the big production countries to those that are most food insecure, that we have very much a global and interconnected food system. So we've just started to release a global monitor as well. Again, these are in response to requests by the G20 and the humanitarian community. Today, we have over 120 bulletins published. These are operational, and these are used very often to inform a large host of decisions. These are often used by humanitarian organizations for as an early warning to help to determine when, where, and how much and what kind of aid is needed. More recently, we're starting to expand on this initiative and recognizing that preventative action requires adequate early warning, especially when you're thinking about early warning systems that can help to alert as early as possible any risks that could be to food production. And therefore, we're expanding on the Crop Monitor work with USAID, with NOAA, and the Climate Hazard Center at UCSB on integrating what we're calling extended seasonal outlooks. So these are looking out 9 to 24 months ahead, and trying to look at different scenarios for possible outcomes on crop shortfalls. And so this is an example that we did for Eastern Africa. Again, the forecasts were put out already ahead of the fourth consecutive failed season for Eastern Africa. And similarly, this is from last year, again, looking at the forecasts that were based on this in April and what the end of season actually looked like in June, with quite a lot of success. And so we're starting to increase the areas in which we're able to provide these extended outlooks as well. Now, the crop monitor model has turned out to be a really helpful way of communicating very quickly on crop condition information, on what kind of drivers are impacting crop development and potential shortfalls. And so the meta-mean, which was also launched by the G20, has adopted now the crop monitor concept and releases a regional bulletin that includes this kind of crop monitor maps and information as well. And this is building on consensus of the countries that participate here. Similarly, we found that actually there's a lot of interest at the national scale for developing this kind of capability and reporting. And so we spend a lot of our time on developing capacity, in particular through our Africa initiative, but not only. And so we're really focused on being able to transfer these kinds of capabilities and tools. And so we work very closely with our partners and making sure that what we're developing is driven by their needs and can be integrated into their own programs, into decision-making processes. And ultimately, the goal is for these countries to then be using the satellite data to be able to better monitor their own agricultural systems. And so we have several different national crop monitors now that are operational, and these also feed back into the global monitoring systems. And to give just one example from Uganda, Uganda's had an operational crop monitor that they're running. And based on information, they were able to have a 3-month early warning for a likely crop failure in the northern part of the country, in Karamoja. And therefore, they were able to proactively mitigate loss and damage, and were able to save around 2.6 million, so about half of their disaster risk budget, and reach 150,000 people. Another example, we're working with a lot of different countries, and here we're working through the FAO country office in Malawi on, again, collecting these kind of ground data and trying to advance our yield models, ultimately both in support of FAO work as well as work within Malawi. And so finally, I want to talk about a relatively new initiative that we've launched called RAPS, Rapid Agricultural Assessments in Support of Policy. And this builds a lot on the technical capabilities, as well as our partnership within the policy community and with industry to be able to be responsive to rapid assessments and to help to inform agricultural and policy decisions. We've seen a tremendous increase in demand for these kinds of remotely sensed agricultural-driven assessment, largely in response to market uncertainty due to increasing erratic and extreme weather, and also had some requests that were directly related to the COVID pandemic. And so I'll give some examples of this work. Our most recent one is on Ukraine. We're working very closely with the government of Ukraine and supporting some of their analysis and looking at the impact that the war is having on their own agricultural system and productivity. And this is important for their own decisions on making strategic food security decisions, for guiding resources, for their surveys, and for adjusting agricultural statistics, especially over the temporarily occupied territories where collecting ground data is not possible. So one of the first things we did here was to map the whole country at the 3-meter resolution on spring crops and winter crops, and then to look at what proportion of different croplands were under occupation. And so, for example, we found that the total cropland is around 23% of total croplands in Ukraine are currently under Russian occupation. Again, remember that Ukraine is a really important breadbasket. It, before the war, was exporting around 10% of global wheat exports, around 42% of sunflower oil exports, and is a very important source of food, actually, for the World Food Program as well. And so when you look at these percentages, for example, winter cereals, the large majority of that is winter wheat. Around 29% of winter cereals are under occupation. And so this can have significant consequences for Ukraine and translate into large also losses for them in terms of revenue. So one of the things we have done here is also to be able to outline actually and delineate automatically every single field in the country, and then we can paint those in with our crop classifications. And this is important because the field is essentially our unit of measure, right, in terms of whatever it is that we're trying to monitor. We're also able to then look at, some of the big questions were around how much area was not planted because of the war, how many fields or what areas or what was the extent of not being able to harvest, in particular winter crops that were planted before the war. And also we've heard a lot about fires and understanding better the extent and the concentration of those. And basically what we found consistently is the biggest impact has been in the occupied territories, but more specifically, really very much directly along the front line of the war. Similarly, we've done work on, this is from the derecho that impacted, this was a strong windstorm that swept across Iowa in August of 2020. This caused different estimated losses of around $31 million in agricultural insurance claim. And we were able to use satellite data to map the damage to corn and to soybeans across Iowa. And we were able to do this within around 10 days, whereas the loss adjustment process took around 4 months, according to some estimates. So again, very strong advantage. And one of the areas we're focused on is on insurance and on climate finance, and trying to look at how do we enable more financial services and resilience and security to farmers if we can better integrate satellite data into some of those information systems. And a final example is also around COVID. And again, this the government of Togo, as part of their COVID response, needed a detailed map of where croplands were in order to provide relief to smallholder farmers that were affected by COVID-related disruptions. And so we, again, turned around a map of croplands at the national scale within around 10 days that then helped to inform their decisions for what their program is called, YOLM, in support of farmers and providing them interest-free loans. Okay, so to conclude, I think global timely monitoring of agricultural production is more pertinent than ever. And as we know, the factors that are influencing food security, climate change, conflict, pests, these we know are going to continue to increase. And our food system is global, and therefore it's pertinent to monitor globally. And satellite data are playing a major and an increasingly major role in helping to provide information that's timely, especially where we cannot get to ground information. At the same time, we've really seen this revolution in terms of advances of remote sensing technology, in terms of machine learning, in terms of cloud computing, that's really helping to revolutionize the agricultural sector and what we can do with these kinds of data. But I think it's really important for us to remember that we need to have international cooperation, like the GeoGLAM initiative is a good example of that, of having partners coming from across the world, from across different sectors, to really be able to realize the full potential of such technologies and how they can then offer to help inform policies and decisions that will ultimately help to save lives and livelihoods around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Becker-Reshef, for that breathtaking overview of the global issue that we face. One question that we had from Ahmed Mansoor, one of our viewers, asks, when was the Harvest program first launched? I know you mentioned the GeoGLAM and that was 2011, etc. But when was Harvest itself first launched? And so, yeah, if you could share some information on that.
Sure. Yeah. Harvest was launched in 2017, building on a lot of work that NASA had already done, and actually in response to a recognition that in the Applied Sciences program at NASA, there was not an agriculture and food security specific program. And in fact, NASA Harvest is a unique program for NASA. It was initially an experimental approach because we were launched as a NASA program, but run actually at a university. And the reason that NASA decided to do that is that they wanted us to have a big impact. And they recognized that if we were sitting inside of NASA headquarters, to be able to partner with different governments, with UN organizations, with the private sector, would be much more complicated. And so they wanted us to be an agile program that could have a large impact, that could partner rapidly, that could respond quickly to different priorities. And therefore they launched us as a consortium in this structure. And they've since decided this is actually a really effective way of running a program. And so now we're just about to start. So we've just wrapped up our first 5 years of Harvest, and we're going into our next 5 years of Harvest.
Thanks. And we have another question from Yasser Bhagat, who asks, what do you think about treating plants in order to withstand adverse weather conditions and drought, as well as to resist agricultural pests? So you didn't touch much on pests. We talked about crop monitoring, but what about pests? And yeah, what about treating plants?
Yeah, there's a lot of work on looking at pest damage and early detection of pest damage. And some of our partners are doing some of that work as well. We're trying to look at different anomalies in data, for example, to detect as early as possible an outbreak, because, right, as we know, pests can spread quite rapidly. And so being able to detect these kinds of impacts as soon as possible. And so there's a lot of research in that space in terms of being able to utilize satellite data. The other way that it's used is often as knowing the different habitats or different conditions where pests outbreaks are conducive for those kinds of outbreaks. And therefore there's a lot of also efforts on modeling activities using satellite data, using climatological kinds of data to look at forecasting and predicting outbreaks or the direction and how they might spread. Thanks.
And so, yeah, you did share some studies in the MENA region. Has there been any work in Egypt in particular?
So we don't have a specific project just focused on Egypt. We do cover it under the crop monitors, in particular the crop monitor for early warning. We also have a new activity that will start up in the next few months with AMIS, looking at climate risk in the 1 to 10 year period. And again, this will be one of the areas where actually we look in general more closely at MENA countries, because some of what we'll try to look at is where is it that we're seeing the frequency of extreme events that are impacting specifically agricultural growth and during critical parts of the growing season. Where have we seen that in the past, and where does it look like this is going to have an even larger impact going into the future, in particular in the 1 to 10 year period? And where is it that we're going to see increased volatility in production due to climate and extreme weather events? The other areas that I think are also relevant is, given that Egypt is a importing country, being able to have transparent information on global markets, on those that are influencing global markets, and that we do have quite a lot of work on, and we have a program specifically focused on looking at supply chains as well.
Right. Yeah. Yes, the COVID situation highlighted this issue of supply chains, etc. So, yeah, supply chain in food security is so connected. So, have there been any harvest climate-related studies that have resulted in unanticipated, surprising results that you didn't think that would happen, and then suddenly you came up during the course of your work had a real surprising thing that, the nature of science is, of course, like that. But I was wondering whether you had any anecdotes to share with us on that front.
Right. I mean, I think for the most part, our work, unfortunately, shows what we expect, and that extreme events are becoming more severe, more frequent. They're having more impact on productivity. So I think on a large scale, no. I think perhaps that it's, the impact is being seen even earlier than initially was anticipated. I mean, I think some of, the details of maybe more interesting work that I talked a little bit about, again, is this work coming out of Stanford on looking at that conservation tillage. I think there's some sense sometimes that if you move to conservation tillage, that yields are going to go down. And what they found is through time, actually, those farmers that moved to conservation tillage, especially when they were then impacted with dry summers, that actually had positive yield impacts on the order of about 3.3% in the Corn Belt region.
Right. Yeah, that was an interesting result in of itself. And could you tell us some good news then? Everything seems so dire these days. And so how are the results of harvest projects being used to help society? And maybe some words of hope and optimism to share with us.
Yeah. I think, for one, all these crises have highlighted how interconnected our systems are, how sensitive they are, and they therefore have also mobilized a lot more awareness and therefore action in that direction. And I think that's very important. And so there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of willingness of different organizations. And I think, again, as I highlighted before, I think cooperation and collaboration and being able to leverage each other's activities and bringing the private sector that might have the resources, they might have the data, with the public sector, and with different startups that are moving in this direction, coming together is how we're going to get to the solutions. And I do believe we are seeing now the technologies and technologies developing very rapidly. And I think having information that's transparent that can then help to inform decisions is really critical. I think we're seeing the policy community, where we started what I talked about, the beginning of GeoGLAN, and trying to show what the capabilities of satellite data. There was a lot of kind of, initially a hard time understanding what the value of that was. And I think today we're in a very different space where the policy community very much recognizes the value of these kinds of technologies and these kinds of information, and is very willing and interesting and really kind of demanding that information so that they can make better policies and they can make better decisions. And we're seeing the same thing on the sustainability side, and on companies who are trying to move to more sustainable production and agriculture, and being able to, again, use these technologies to evaluate their own successes, and also to be able to monitor what they're doing and move in that direction, and again, develop the evidence actually that's needed to move us in this direction. So I think there are a lot of grim news, but I think there is also a lot more awareness, a lot more hope, a lot more willingness to work together to ultimately get us to where we need to be.
Thank you. And talking about, working together and collaborating, so what are the mechanisms that harvest researchers have to work with other researchers, or maybe even, private industry, etc.? So let's say that something is funded by one program, and then there's a harvest program, and then how do they interact between each other on similar topics or shared interests that they might have?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think by design, when we started the program, we recognized that we had a very low budget. And so for us to make an impact, we needed to be able to leverage what other people are doing. And so part of what we sought was, according to the priorities for our program, we sought those leading organizations, those leading scientists, those leading organizations that had an impact in this space to partner with them, to leverage what they were already doing and build on what they were doing in order to have an impact. So as I've stated, we are a consortium of over 40 different partners. So by nature, pretty much all of our projects are collaborative and have a end user, and they might have a private sector, and they have a public sector, and researchers or a space agency. So we've got a lot of, socio-economists that we're working with. So it's quite dynamic in terms of how we're working and the different partnerships. I should also say we often will go for co-funding. So if we identify an area that's really important, we might go for co-funding with another partner or another private sector organization. But we've also found that there are many different ways that we can partner. And so one of the areas that we found a lot of value with the private sector is going back to one of the points I made. Ground data is really, really important, right? It's important for us to be able to validate and to train and to understand what the satellite from above is seeing and how that actually relates to the ground. And the private sector has a lot of that kind of data. And so what we're finding is sometimes we can actually build partnership where a private sector company will provide us with ground data, and in return, we'll do analysis and develop models that then are very beneficial for them. And so we're looking for these different kinds of mutually beneficial partnerships that can benefit and ultimately get us to where we want. The other thing that I think is really important is sustainability and continuity of the kind of work that we do, right? You don't want to have a project that comes and says, hey, we've got a great technology, we're going to set it all up, and then 2 years later say, okay, well, our funding is out, bye. Because then what you've actually done is almost more harm, because you've set up an expectation, you've developed something, and then you're not there to carry it through. And so, again, that means that we are often, that's why the end users are so important, and making sure that what we're developing is needed, and that they then have a budget, or we can come up with creative ways in which to make sure that this is sustainable and will actually have an impact in the long term.
So right from the onset, you think about the sustainability issue, and so it's not like a 3-year thing and then it suddenly dropped off a precipice. But then if viewers want to know, how can they engage with the Harvest program? Do you have solicitations, calls for funding, or do people get in touch with you with their resources, be it cash or kind? It could be data, as you said. So how can someone from Egypt get engaged and be participating in aspects of the Harvest program that may be relevant to them?
So one thing I should have said up front, NASA Harvest is not a funding program. So we have funding, our core funding comes from NASA, but we also have funding from private sector, we have funding from different foundations, et cetera. But what I would suggest, but we're always interested in partnerships, especially partnerships that can expand, can scale, can test out another way of implementing what a particular tool set or type of information that we've developed. I would say a really good place to start is with our website. We've got a lot of information there on the different activities, the different initiatives, the different programs. And I would say then we're always happy. We have a link on the website to get in touch with us, and we're always happy to hear from you and find ways in which we can partner and expand this work. Or we might know of another scientist or another group that would be more relevant or interesting, and so we're always happy also to be able to connect.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, are there any climate-related harvest projects that are particularly relevant to Egypt? But what you told me is that we need to go to the website and look for perhaps similar projects in semi-arid regions and see what they're doing, and then see what Egyptian scientists, colleagues might want to do, and then get in touch with you and work that way. That's the path forward, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, what I can say is projects that I think would be perhaps particularly of interest. One will be this new project we're starting up on climate risk with the AMIS community. I think the crop monitors are an area, supply chains, and then perhaps more on perhaps it's around crop type mapping, and perhaps it's not something we've done specifically in Egypt, but the methods and the approaches we've done, or looking at different practices, could be relevant as well. So I think there's probably quite a lot within our portfolio that would be of a lot of interest to scientists in Egypt working on climate and agriculture. And so we're very happy to reach out and to connect.
So I wanted to ask you a question. So I'm aware of the AgMIP program that NASA also funds, and what's your? Do you have connections with them? That's, of course, that's model centric, and yours is observations, so use of observations. But basically, the problem is more or less the same. Yeah, looking at agriculture, climate. So
we do. So they sit in the RNA program. We absolutely do have a connection and collaborations. And in fact, one of the first slides I showed was coming from AgMIP on looking at the forecasts of climate and impact on crop yields. We've had a project with them on looking at how to better integrate remote sensing into some of the biophysical and crop models that are run under AgMIP. And we're working on a kind of a landscaping study with them on looking at different models, different approaches, and where remote sensing comes in crop modeling and forecasting.
Yeah, right. And do you have like PI, researcher meetings where people come together and share results? Maybe international scientists come together and sort of exchange results that they've done, maybe specifically for their region. Do you have meetings like that? And would that be available? That information be available on the website as well?
We will put that kind of information on the website. We've had in the past what we've called an all hands harvest meeting, but we try oftentimes recognizing that, travel is often quite consuming. We try to build on or have meetings at other international meetings where we know a lot of people are going. So that might be the American Geophysical Union, that might be the ESA Living Planet, it might be more World Agri-Tech, more on the private sector side. So we participate in different events, and we do have a newsletter that goes out also every month that has a lot of information there as well of different activities or different seminars or webinars or conferences or sessions that might be being organized. We usually have quite a lot of attendance also more on the computer science and machine learning kinds of workshops and conferences. So we have different areas that we're focused on, and a lot of that information would be in our newsletter on our website as well. But we do try to leverage as much as we can other meetings and then get together there.
Excellent. And on a personal note, do you ever travel to Egypt for work, to attend seminars or events like the COP27? Will you be, will Harvest be having a presence? If you're able to share that information, of course. If it's pre-decisional, that's fine too.
Yeah. I have not yet, although I would absolutely love to, and I look forward to traveling to Egypt. In terms of COP, NASA will certainly have a presence there, as will GeoGlam, and part of the work we're doing with GeoGlams on national adaptation plans and looking at how to integrate at the national scale these kinds of tools and monitoring. At this moment, I don't think anybody from NASA Harvest is planning to be there, although that still could change and one of us might come.
So you mentioned the American Geophysical Union meeting. So that's where to look out for. Do you typically have town halls or do you have sessions?
Pre-COVID, we always had a session. And then during COVID, I think we did on some of the remote. This year is, I think, the first year we don't actually have our own session, although there'll be a lot of our partners and scientists that are going to be traveling and presenting our work at AGU this year.
Yeah, you're handling and addressing a very complicated, program, and which is so important for humanity. Food security, food, agriculture. Yeah, it's just so. Want to thank you for sharing your insights, and thank you for doing this. Choosing this career path, and thank you for sharing your insights with us. If you have any last words for our viewers, please go ahead. Else I'll turn it to Donna Wiss for some final remarks.
But thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to share on what we're doing. And again, I think we're always happy for people to reach out and to find ways in which we can collaborate or learn from each other. So please do. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Becker-Reshef. I'll turn it over to Donna.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bomzai. Again, I would like to express my thanks to Dr. Becker-Reshef and to Dr. Bomzai for leading a really fascinating program. I happen to be from the state of Iowa in the United States. It's where agriculture is extremely important. So although I'm in Cairo, I'm really interested in these issues myself. But as promised, I wanted to also share some information about our American spaces if you're not familiar. We have an American Center here in Cairo. We have physical centers in Alexandria and then in Mahdi on the outskirts of Cairo. We welcome you to inquire about more information. I'm going to try to share my screen here in a second so that you can get out your camera and you can scan the QR code that I'm going to be showing. So one second. I think this is the one I want. Yes. All right.
You're on mute. I can't hear you. Donna, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me at all?
Yep, now we can.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I don't know. Anyway, please scan the QR code that we're showing on the screen. And we invite you to find out more about our virtual programs. Please contact us at those contact details. And we want to thank you again for joining us. We look forward to having you participate in our future virtual programs and in our workshop series such as this one. So with that, we wish you all a good night. Thank you all.
Thanks.